Hi, welcome back to my channel, Bookshelf Mystic. Today, I'll be talking about the book 1491 by Charles C. Mann. This is a nonfiction book, and I listened to it as an audiobook, one of my favorite ways to read nonfiction books. I think audiobooks make a great sort of long podcast exploring some of these topics that I'd like to learn more about in detail, but don't always have the attention span to sit and read physical texts for. 1491 sets out to correct what the author Charles C. Mann calls Holmberg's mistake. The understanding that Native American cultures in the Americas were limited to small groups of hunter-gatherers or nomadic tribes living in a vast, untamed wilderness. Now, the reason this is called Holmberg's mistake is because this understanding of Native Americans comes from the assumption that how white explorers and white settlers encountered these people is the way that they had always been. When in reality, there were large, sprawling civilizations with tens of thousands or more people living in them that had been just recently decimated by disease, brought over unknowingly, for the most part, by Europeans. And this disease outpaced the rate of exploration by the Europeans, such that when they encountered new civilizations and new societies, those societies had already been ravaged by these diseases. It's estimated that something like 90% of people in the Americas died as a result of contact with Europeans. Mann makes the analogy that making assumptions about Indian cultures based on this view of them post-massive pandemic and societal collapse is like making assumptions about the survivors of the Holocaust based on, how they looked once concentration camps were liberated. So Mann goes on then to talk about a large variety of the civilizations that were present at the time of Europeans making contact, as well as before. The book goes through three main questions that archaeologists and academics have been trying to understand about people living in the Americas. The first question is, how many people were there before Europeans came to the Americas? The second question is, how long had those people been in the Americas? And the third question is, how did those people work within or on their environment? All three of these are fascinating questions, and Mann goes into a lot of detail talking about the academic discourse about the number of people living in the Americas, probably a lot more than you think, how long they've been here, also probably a lot longer than you think, and how they made an impact on their environment, also probably a lot more than you think. What I found the most fascinating was that third question, although all three were really interesting. Mann talks about two different areas of the Americas that evidence is coming to suggest was really heavily shaped by the people living there. He talks about on the eastern seaboard and sort of the eastern part of what is now the United States, Indians consciously shaped the environment to allow for more big game, allow for the types of food and plants to grow that they wanted to grow, and to let them practice the type of agriculture that they wanted to do. Actually, this kind of extended across the entire North American continent through the practice of controlled burns to clear out the plants that weren't wanted and to cultivate the existence of the plants that were. To the point where when Europeans came to North America and found these wide garden-like forests with paths through the trees that a stagecoach could travel down easily, that wasn't an untouched wilderness, that was a consciously created environment. Similarly, Amazonia is the other area that Mann focuses on heavily to answer this question of how much native societies impacted their environment. He states that something like up to a quarter of the Amazon rainforest could have actually been influenced and really sculpted by the people living there. There's a school of thought that the soil in the Amazon rainforest can't support large agriculture, so the people living there pre-industrial era must have lived in small groups, subsisting only on gathering the food they could find in the rainforest and fishing in the rivers. However, there's evidence that Mann presents that these people actually could have consciously cultivated the plants that they wanted to see, the type of forest they wanted to live in, such that the rainforest in many places could be said to be a human invention. Now, this has, I think, profound implications for environmentalism, and Mann makes this point that if we assume that the best way to interact with nature is to let it to go back to the way it naturally is, that may not be the best for either us or the environment. Instead, learning to coexist and figure out how to work with the environment is what a lot of these cultures did very successfully, and that is ultimately what, this is sort of extending his thesis, what the goal of environmental and conservation movements should be. Not to eliminate human presence, but to allow humans to sustainably shape the environment to live in harmony. I think this book does a really great job humanizing, dignifying, and letting us relate to the cultures that it describes. There is a long segment at the beginning about the Pilgrims who came over to present-day Massachusetts in 1620 and what they encountered there. So it really looks at a lot of what we've learned about the Thanksgiving mythos and how that's really very different than what's presented, I think, in American culture. Tisquantum, or Squanto as we usually call him, for example, was a person who knew English fluently, consciously sought out the Pilgrims to help them for political reasons, was actually taken to Europe for 7 years, which is where he learned to speak English, and escaped his captivity there to come back to the Americas, just to find that his town where he grew up was abandoned because of plague. Didn't know any of that. Also didn't know that the Indians that the Pilgrims encountered, the Pilgrims likely saw them as technological equals. I think we often think of Europeans encountering Native Americans and seeing them as these backwards, primitive people. But the Pilgrims didn't think that. In fact, the Indians probably thought the Pilgrims were technologically inferior, given that the Pilgrims had no idea how to survive a New England winter. There's a part at the end, and I don't know if this is a spoiler because it's a nonfiction book, but the ending of the book discusses how the United States Constitution may have been influenced by the Great Law of Peace in the Haudenosaunee civilization, also known as the Iroquois Nation. It's really, really interesting that Mann, makes these connections between these ideas of liberty and egalitarianism that weren't very common in European civilizations at the time, but were codified into the societal law of the Native Americans that were exchanging ideas with the Europeans. This idea that, the Constitution and the framers of the Constitution may have been heavily influenced by Native societies, certainly not something you hear about today, but fascinating. The ending of the book kind of concludes with this idea that we as modern, moral thinkers may have more in common with a member of the Haudenosaunee Nation than the Pilgrims at the time if we were to go back in time to talk to them, which is really striking. Being asked to relate to someone of another culture is one of the best ways to try to understand them. Reading this book was kind of like learning about Roman aqueducts or the signing of the Magna Carta or any other great achievement of civilization for the first time. There is an entire hemisphere's worth of innovation, philosophy, and culture that I feel we do not know enough about, or perhaps do not talk enough about, that developed almost entirely separately from the rest of the world and is fascinating. For example, the Aztec Empire had highly educated clerics who had their own philosophy, worldview, and had great thinkers, like Plato or Socrates or other philosophers of the Greeks and Romans. Just think about how much we, as a world, have missed out on because those cultures were nearly erased. There's a profound sense of sadness when thinking about that first question that Mann sets out to address: how many people were living in the Americas? May have been more than in the rest of the world, or comparable. Those civilizations nearly collapsed, and we have almost nothing from many of those societies. It's fascinating. It's horrifying. It makes me want to learn more, and it makes me wish that these ideas that aren't necessarily new in academic circles, but that Mann is bringing forth in this book for the first time for me and probably many others, makes me wish that this is what we were taught. Anyway, this book was great. I highly recommend it. Mann does get very detailed at times in his exploration of the archaeological findings of a specific dig site or the farming methods of the Maya or something. But it's really, really worth it, I think. If you're not of a mind to get into those details, it does become worth it. He ties them all together in such a great way. Again, I recommend the audiobook, especially if you're not that much of a detail person, because you can sort of listen to it and push through to the conclusions that Mann is making. If you've read 1491, feel free to leave your thoughts in a comment. I would love to hear what you have to say. If you have any other recommendations for me that I might find interesting based on this book, I'd also love to hear them. And for those of you who haven't read 1491, highly recommend. Of the 3 books I've read in 2021, this is the top, so we'll see if it gets unseated later this year. Thanks for watching my video, hope you enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on 1491.